by formalising having more Russian troops within Belarus. Eventually, probably we could agree that Belarus is almost partially fallen to Russia anyway, and therefore probably going to fall.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1,302 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, or his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking once again to Sean Bell. Now Sean, a former RAF fighter pilot, Harrier pilot, that's fighter pilot, up there with the highest levels of the elite, because it's a really good aircraft, but I'm slightly biased. Air Vice Marshal in the RAF, military analyst, co-founder of Red Matrix Productions, and the High Ground podcast, and ambassador for the RAF Association, which is very appropriate because this is the day after Battle of Britain Memorial Day.
Absolutely
Sean,
right.
Welcome back to Frontline.
Philip, great pleasure to be here.
Now, there's lots going on in the air at the moment. We've had this incursion of Russian drones into Poland. Was it an incursion or was it deliberate? What are your thoughts?
Well, you and I have been watching the conflict ever since it started back in February 22, and it hasn't been rare that drones or rounds or missiles have flown through NATO airspace, and bluntly, NATO's done nothing about it.
Yep.
And so if you were Putin and you wanted to rattle NATO and thought NATO was maybe starting to come up with a plan to do something about you, you'd throw a few drones their way. And it wasn't one or two, it was 19. They didn't just go a couple of kilometres in. Reports I've read 40 or 50 kilometres in. Now, yes, understandably, Russia has immediately turned around and said, we never intended to target anybody there.
It was an accident, old boy.
Yeah, and you sort of go, just imagine that was our country, 40 or 50 miles from the coast, you're into sort of London. Yeah. How would we feel about that? And the danger is, if it had killed somebody, Russia shouldn't have done it. It's sovereign territory. So the real question for me was, did they do it intentionally or not? The struggle I have intellectually is Russia is struggling with progress in the war at the moment. It is making progress, but it's a lot slower. We'll probably get into that than maybe they expected. Would they really want to provoke the West into getting more involved? Probably no. Well, if it was accidental, as you and I both know, Russia is not famous for its high-quality military equipment. Those drones, the Shaheeds and those the non-armed versions, they're a few grand each. And when we were doing when you and I were doing targeting in any wars, you struggled to get 1, 2, 10, 15 targets. Russia's doing 1,000 a night. So who is actually programming those things? Some poor bloke who's just tapping away at numbers. It's not that he might have got a lat or a long wrong on it somewhere. Plus there's jamming, the like. Does that excuse Russia? Absolutely not. But it's provoked a whole series of reactions. The one that made me chuckle, though, was that we summoned the Russian ambassador to the Foreign Office. I bet Putin was quaking in his boots.
Well, yes, it was the classic good old British stiff letter. However, Poland then called Article 4 of NATO. And Article 4, from my perspective, is a NATO collective stiff letter. It hasn't got much more behind it than that. Do you think that was the right response?
I think there's some diplomatic things they have to do. And if Article 4 rather than Article 5, because I suspect NATO, if you start to provoke Article 5, we're going to now get involved. I think that would, if you then decided not to, then Putin would go, okay, how much further can I turn the wick up? So call it something else, and that gives you a bit more diplomatic leverage. I think, from my personal perspective, is that standing in the corner of the ring and letting the other boxer come out and keep boxing and punching you and not doing anything about it feels wrong. And any one drone going across into sovereign airspace, into NATO airspace, should be dealt with severely, so that Putin puts a buffer zone. When I was operating in Germany, remember the buffer zone between East and West Germany?
Oh, yes.
It was only there to stop any chance of you nibbling across the border. So that buffer zone, don't go anywhere near it. If you do, at least, as a few people did occasionally, you don't actually cause a massive diplomatic incident. So I think we've got to be a lot more robust about it, and shooting down 2 or 3 of the drones isn't more robust. And I do wonder, I've said for the last couple of days, I do think it's getting us closer to putting a no-fly zone. And I do notice in the newspapers today that it's starting to gain a bit of momentum now with European leaders that say, are we just going to stand on the goal line and let Russia keep kicking balls at us to try and score a goal? Or are we actually going to start pushing out a bit? And I'm not suggesting no-fly zone goes over Russia, but actually extending it over parts of Ukraine to provide a buffer zone to make sure that NATO is protected would seem sensible to me.
Yeah, well, I'll come on to that in a moment. But from an old, stick my old intelligence officer's hat on, and from the Russian perspective, seeing one or two drones that have accidentally gone into NATO countries and there's little response, by sending a few in collectively, you can, one, test the NATO military response. You can test the NATO and Coalition of the Willing's political response. You can test, more importantly, Donald Trump's political response to it, and you can gather so much information from that that will allow you to work out what other options there may be for you to potentially fracture different coalitions or political thinkings across NATO and all the rest of it. Do you think Putin might have put that level of consideration in, and this would have been a deliberate act by him to gather that? And at the same time, you're sending a little message into Poland in particular, where most of the military supplies that are going into Ukraine, and especially through one or two airfields that people have suggested were on a target list, that's trying to hit all those objectives.
I think it's possible. You and I, with a bottle of wine in the middle of the table, could have a good go at that one.
We'll get one opened.
Yeah, I do think there's a couple of reasons though why I don't subscribe to that. One of which is would be a lot more effective ways if Putin genuinely wanted to provoke NATO. And the one thing he doesn't want to do is give NATO more justification for bolstering its military on the borders. And the one aspect that leads me to believe it's more by accident than by design is that Zapad 25 exercise, which was, for my money, much more focused, much more saber-rattling. Yep. We can get into all of the objectives of that. But ever since that drone incursion, we've watched Russia scale down its ambitions on the nuclear side. Yep. It moved the exercise much further away from the borders, and the political rhetoric was all cooling down. It's almost like Russia went, that was a mistake, and the danger is people will link these two together, and therefore we've seen them back off. So it leads up, we'll probably never know is the answer, but it leads me more down the path that this was a mistake. I'm not forgiving them for it. They should be punished for it. But it feels less like a deliberately well-considered provocation.
A mistake with 19. But then those 19 could have come from one or two launchers.
19 out of 1,000. One person, still,
a small percentage. But you mentioned Zapad. Zapad 25, a biannual exercise between Russia and Belarus. Happening in Belarus this year. The previous one that was due in 2023 was cancelled. The one before that was used as a cover to build up the Russian military forces to carry out its invasion of Ukraine. What are you making of this year's Zapad 25?
Well, again, it's quite interesting to study it from a military perspective. So why would Russia do it when it's still involved in a grueling war of attrition? But it did make quite a big thing out of the nuclear drills it was going to run, having deployed nuclear weapons into Belarus. It was only, I think, of December last year that Russia and Belarus signed a treaty, Alexander Lukashenko, the last European dictator, and part of that was putting Belarus under the nuclear umbrella of Russia. Now, so why would Russia do that? Probably just to make clear that NATO will look after Belarus if anything happens. Also by formalising having more Russian troops within Belarus. Eventually, probably we could agree that Belarus is almost partially fallen to Russia anyway, and therefore probably going to fall. I think the one thing that was interesting, though, was I think there were something like 3,000 or 4,000 Russian forces involved, about 10,000 Belarusian, which sounds like quite a lot if you were the British Army. But 4 years ago, it was 200,000 involved. So it was a microcosm of what it was before. And I think it was a two-phase operation. First phase was land and air incursion to Belarus. The second phase was kicking them out, sort of doing a counterattack. And as you and I know, that it's one thing having mass, but you need to operate together with each other, because different nations have different ways of doing things, different frequencies, different standard operating procedures. So after 4 years, I can see militarily why it would be useful. I think the worry for me, though, was that it wasn't a coincidence. I've got a list of them here. Poland did Iron Defender at the same time, which was something like 30,000 troops, including from America and Canada. You work clockwise round. Lithuania, they had Thunder Strike, 17,000 troops. Go to Latvia, 12,000. Germany was doing a maritime exercise, and America was doing Iron Fist. All of that was at the same time. So you've now got a war-fighting country doing drills. You've got NATO doing defensive drills. What on earth would have happened then would another 19 drones going across the border, rather landing in an open field, landing in the middle of a brigade of NATO forces? All of a sudden now, the risk of these things getting horribly out of control would be very real. So I think whether it's actually a credible military exercise, I think it's far more for Russia demonstrating that to Ukraine, we attack through you. So you have to watch that northern border. That distracts ground forces on Ukraine. You can't all go to fight on the southeast of Ukraine. You have to keep some up there. And also it demonstrates that Russia eventually will take Belarus, and the more often its soldiers are in there, the more it just gets used to them being around. Yeah, well, there's so much in that. I think you said NATO protect Belarus when you actually meant Putin protect Belarus. Putin protect. My apologies. There's a treaty between the two of them.
Exactly. No,
it's part of Putin trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, isn't it?
It's the slip of the tongue that I put in a lot. But again, Lukashenko from Belarus had turned around and said whenever Russian tactical nuclear weapons were placed in Belarus, he said, but if they're in my country, then I can use them the way I want to. And I think this is probably Putin suggesting, no, these are the procedures for them. At the same time, we see Russian naval drills with their hypersonic missiles being fired from submarines against surface targets, sending clear messages out. But those NATO countries' exercises going on, which were in numbers terms significantly larger than the combined Belarus-Russian numbers. I think it's both sides showing off to each other the capability and trying to give this air of deterrence without ramping things up. A very, very dangerous game.
No, it is a dangerous game. I mean, what's interesting, that missile, because it's a Zircon, the hypersonic missile they fired. And you remember that was the one that President Putin famously said is indestructible. Nobody's got an answer.
Until a Patriot shot a time.
Until a Patriot shot a few of them down.
Yes. How old's a Patriot compared to the Zircon? Yes.
Yeah, and you don't want to show all of your secrets, do you? Because your enemy works out how to shoot them down. Yeah. But I do think what was interesting, again, given that they're at war, they won't have many Zircon missiles spare. Yeah. Why would you waste one on an exercise unless it was trying to demonstrate something? And I'm not sure the demonstration there was for a Belarusian audience. I suspect that was for a NATO audience. But who knows?
Well, but it's interesting you say demonstrate, because at the exercise this year, we had a small Indian contingent, but there was a big thing made about India actually participating. It only put 65 troops in, but a lot of observers from elsewhere. And therefore, how much do you think this exercise is aimed at showing the Russian and the Belarusian people that, yes, there may be a special military operation going on in Ukraine. To the rest of the world, it's a full-scale war. But we're still a powerful military, and we still do our normal military stuff because this exercise proves it. And also to this wider coalition and maybe the BRICS community that's out there that Russia is part of, to say we're still a global power in what we're doing. Look at our exercises, and we've got 65 people from India participating and observers from China and North Korea and elsewhere. Do you think he was trying to send messages out those ways?
So you're a former British Army guy. You used to do some very good firepower demonstrations pretty regularly. Yeah. And I remember watching some of the correspondence, near that, and they
used to participate in them and coming in at big speeds, and that was a good bit.
Yeah, no, exactly. But the point being is that these are not unusual. And when we did firepower demonstrations, we would invite a lot of people to come and observe. I think so. Observing and whether it's in detail or at the higher level is one thing. Actually putting a brigade of soldiers on the ground and participating is something else. India didn't get involved in any of that. And I do think what you touch on is what Russia's been desperately trying to do is to demonstrate the West is trying to isolate Russia, drive its economy into the ground and force Putin to stop the war. What Putin's very effectively done is form a different coalition with China, with Iran, and is forcing countries like India to get off the fence. Now, India's normally been very good at sitting on the fence, but of course, there's more and more, more and more penalties hit India for the sanctions or the tariffs and the like. It's forcing India to spread bet a bit. And I suspect that's what we're seeing is not a large number of people, but, at the moment, India consumes a lot of Russian oil. And therefore, India's getting a good deal on on oil. It's having to pay a significant discount to the market. So that benefits India. Therefore, they want to keep Russia sweet. They also don't want to alienate the West. And therefore, putting a few people to watch a firepower demo in another country, I think the danger is we overthink that a bit. But again, the optics of it are really interesting. And there's no doubt in my mind, watching Putin host a whole load of BRICS countries, having an alternative, whether we call it the axis of evil, but he is very successfully stopping himself being forced into oblivion. And actually, they are creating a new world order. And I wonder whether history will look back on this period and say, far from isolating Russia, what we actually did was fragment NATO. And we speak on the day that Trump is, doing his state visit to the UK. Goodness knows what headlines are going to come out from this.
Well, we'll see. There could be other headlines that come out of the government that will trump any of Trump's headlines, but that's for a different podcast, I think. Going back to, before we touch on potential no-fly zones over Ukraine, going back to the reaction to the drones, UK Secretary of State has said that he's going to authorise UK Typhoons to be deployed onto the Polish border area to help carry out air policing and to deal with the potential drone threat that's coming in. But these are going to be based in the UK. Is it appropriate that they're flown from the UK, and can they provide an effective military presence going from the UK to Poland and back to the UK again? Is how I understand it's going to be. And secondly, you also mentioned that these drones are a few $100,000 each maximum.
No, not even 100,000, just 1,000. Just a few thousand.
A few $1,000 each maximum. We're putting a multi-million-pound aircraft which fires missiles that are in the £1 million a pop. Is that the right way of dealing with a drone threat?
Well, in the short answer to that second part is evidently no. But bear in mind that most modern fighter jets have a cannon as well. And my understanding is that actually shooting down a drone with a fighter jet is quite tricky because they fly quite low and they also fly very slow. Whereas fighter jets generally fly very fast.
So do we need the Harrier jump jet back?
Now we're talking, right? Or the Strike Master, bring something back. There was a question from one of the viewers the other day about do we need to bring in a Tucano or something lighter weight that can shoot? And there is evidently a need. So shooting down drones in volume with missiles is evidently not the right answer. But you can use a strafing, and with a bit of practice, that's not difficult to do. And besides, aircraft is not generally the right way to shoot down drones. You'd probably get some sort of, lying on your back with a machine gun is quite an effective way. You can put high-tech guns that fire a lot of rounds. At sea, it's the phalanx. There's lots of, as you know better than I, there's lots of land-based systems that can do that. Part of this is gesture. Part of this is actually the UK government going, there's something more. Going back to your point, I know we can take these things literally. I think what they meant is that we are going to deploy more Typhoons from the UK because we operate them out of Cyprus. We also operate out, we man the eastern flank of NATO, not only with Estonia, but Poland and others, where our regular NATO deployments, where we cycle through there. because yes, we've got air-to-air refueling and the like, but it's not good use of assets and hours to fly them backwards and forwards to the UK. I'd be very surprised if that's the way that they were being done. But I do think in terms of, do you just continue the cycle of our Typhoons deploying for 4 months and then coming home again? What I read into that statement was the British government's going, no, we're going to turn up the wick a bit. We're going to get more assets involved. But I think there's a bigger point here, honestly. I think we're entering a profound moment in this conflict. You and I have looked at this for over 3 years now, and the British government's done enough to stop Ukraine losing, but not enough to help it win. With Donald Trump being a little bit more vague, looking more supportive of Putin, I think the question is, are we nationally or Europeans going to watch Ukraine fail? Might fail slower without support, but it's still failing, and have to deal with the consequences of that. Or are we getting close to the time where actually we have to do something about it? And you both know Putin isn't going to stop until either he's achieved his objectives or he's forced to stop. And the two ways of forcing him is either economically or militarily. Nobody wants him to get into nuclear conflict, and everybody goes, oh, you're suggesting we go to war, that'll be a nuclear war. You go, right, these grey hairs mean that I was in the military when we were in the Cold War. And actually, nuclear weapons are one thing that kept the peace, because nobody is incentivized. But it doesn't stop you standing toe-to-toe, face-to-face with someone like Putin. It's not in his best interest to start a war, but until somebody stands up to him, and we're not talking about invading Russia, we're talking about potentially doing a little bit more to actually stop him in Ukraine and actually protect Ukraine. And we've now got the excuse that it's about protecting the eastern flank of NATO.
So protecting Ukraine, that leads very nicely into the potential for creating some form of no-fly zone or air defence zone or protection zone or something over part of Ukraine. How would that begin to look? And do you think we could come up with the right military rules and within that rules of engagement and everything else to do this safely, if you can ever call carrying out an offensive military operation a safe thing?
So I think it's all about rules of engagement. But I would ask you what we mean by safe.
Well, safe. There's militarily safe. So making sure that our military personnel that are involved in this are safe, and therefore right.
They can't go into conflict and be guaranteed to be safe.
And then there's political safety, and what are the associated risks with that? Because you can never say anything from an absolute perspective. So it's shades of grey on a spectrum, and you have to work out where that is so that the politicians can see whether it's acceptable or unacceptable, the risk they're taking.
No, and I think what's lovely is that we're both a little bit of students of history, and you look to Chamberlain, 38, Munich Conference, Peace in Our Time.
Waving the papers.
Yeah.
Is that Donald Trump at the moment?
Because nobody wants to go to war. I mean, people sort of look at you and I and go, you warmongers, no wonder you want to go to war. And you go, I've spent 2 years of my life, 3 tours in Afghanistan. When you see the price we pay for going to war, nobody serving in the military ever wants to see war. But you also recognise that the best way to avoid it is having robust deterrence in place so that your enemy thinks the risks are involved far outweigh the benefits they're going to get. And we seem to have lost sight of that at the moment.
Yeah, well, there's a few things about conflict. People forget that war, militaries getting involved is not something in isolation from politics. War is politics by other means, and it's whenever the talking has failed. And I take great not delight, but I will tell all of the peace flag-waving do-gooders who are trying to get me to sign up for Greenpeace and ban the bomb and all the rest of it, that no, I fight for peace rather than protest for peace, and I'm a pacifist at heart. And I would say that most people in the military who have experienced conflict are actually pacifists. The last thing you ever want to do is have to put the training that you've got into action where you're taking another human being's life. If you have to do it, you do it professionally, you do it surgically, and you do it within the law. But it's the last thing that you ever want to do. And it's only by showing the ability to do that from a professional perspective that you can deter another aggressor, because human beings are an aggressive species. And until we can get that aggression out of us as a species and out of different nations, then the unfortunate reality is there will be fighting, there will be wars, and we have to live with that.
I do wonder whether some of this, though, because it's, yesterday was the Battle of Britain, and I read a disturbing article that said that a majority of people under the age of 40 didn't really know what the Battle of Britain was celebrating. And you sort of go, how is it that, on that 15th of September 1940, when we're backs against the wall, we were down to our last couple of hundred aircraft, and it was us or Germany starting Operation Sea Lion and invading the country. And through the immense sacrifice of the fighter pilots that day, we stood firm. Hitler decided to switch to bombing London and eventually abandoned Sea Lion altogether. Yep. And from that, of course, that gave us the platform from which to ultimately take over. So many would argue that was the turning point. And what I find a tragedy is that, was it March this year, I think, we lost the last of the Battle of Britain veterans. Yeah. So the human story behind it dies. We've still got people like Colin Bell, Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, Distinguished Flying Cross, 104 and a half. Yes. You'll still bump into him at the RAF club on his feet, deaf as a doornail, but a fantastic inspiration.
Can he still drink you under the table?
Regrettably, yes. And it's lovely because he even says, I say, how do you manage it? He said, well, I wake up each day, I'm still alive. So I live my life. But the point is, I think it's gradually fading from our psyche. It's a tragedy that yesterday the news wasn't filled with let's help educate the people of this country. So when it comes to sacrifices, we enjoy the country, the freedoms that we have today because of the sacrifice of a generation. What lessons should we learn from that? The appeasement doesn't work. Eventually, you've got to stand up. So returning to your question, there is no military operation without risk. There is, but would I want to see us put a brigade of soldiers on the ground in Ukraine and watch the risk of a hypersonic missile taking out 1,000 of our fantastic British soldiers? No. Would I be prepared to put a state-of-the-art military fighter jet with the best in the world sat in the cockpit that would be Russia would have no answer to, and that the worst that can happen is that jet gets shot down. The guy ejects, but he's ejecting over Ukraine soil, a bit like the Battle of Britain. Dust him down, give him a pint, get him back in the air again. And tragically, if he does lose his life, at least it's in a worthy cause, but it's one life. And I think the political risk is low, the human risk is low, but technology is our asymmetric advantage, and it would put a massive consideration into Putin's calculus. And I think that's something that would cause him a moment's thought.
Yeah, and it's balancing that risk. And the country that seems to be taking the risk to keep us safe, to allow our youth not to remember what the Battle of Britain was about and the sacrifice that was made, seem to be the Ukrainian people at the moment. Do you think the reality is that Ukraine is fighting a defensive war for the rest of us in Europe and holding Vladimir Putin back? Has he got ambitions beyond Ukraine?
So, as you know, I go out to Ukraine relatively regularly on my own steam, not formally, just to do a little bit of charity work, but also get a feeling on the ground. When I first went out there, there was a sense of we're going to win. This is, we're going to kick the Russians out. Last time I went out, there was much more a sense this has gone on a long time. We just need to draw it to an end. When you push them a little bit about fighting on behalf of us, actually, that's not the way they couch it. They are incredibly grateful for the support that's provided. But they also turn around and say, if we hadn't given up our nuclear weapons, Russia would never have invaded. Yeah. You, the West, you, America, you, the UK and Russia, in the Budapest memo, you guaranteed our sovereignty if we gave up nuclear weapons. And we were persuaded. Yeah. 20 years later, what did you do when that piece of paper was ripped up? Nothing. So you made us defenseless, and then you didn't come and honour the agreement. Now, whatever the truth of the matter is, they are still incredibly grateful, but they are very quick to point out that they, in a way, feel vulnerable because of the mistakes of the past. And I think that's why, whatever happens in the negotiations, territory or whatever, the real focus is on the security guarantees, because they will not take a little bit of paper signed by President Putin as being a guarantee of security for the future.
But then they've had security guarantees beforehand, as you said, with the Budapest memorandum, and the West has failed to live up to them, because any security guarantees that are signed on a bit of paper and may result in the deployment of some troops on the ground or a few aircraft here, in 20 years' time, governments will go, oh, well, that's all fine, I'll withdraw it. But the circumstances on the ground, the ambitions of Russia and elsewhere may not have changed one iota. Do you think we're a long, long way off being able to get any form of peace agreement or draft peace agreement that would be acceptable, that would provide long-term solution for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the way I would answer that question is that, again, Ukrainians don't see this as a war that started in 2014.
Yeah.
They remind you it's a 300-year war. For 300 years, Russia's been trying to wipe out our language, our culture, our people, our communities, our way of life. So, and they're just not going to stop.
Yeah.
So their view is that if you negotiate a temporary cessation, that's all it will be. So somehow you've got to make something a lot more robust about it. That's why NATO membership was always the thing that President Zelensky was championing. The harsh reality of it is, though, at the moment, Putin has most of the aces.
Yep.
So we can write all the letters of disgust. We can summon ambassadors all we like. We can express our displeasure at what Putin's doing. But bluntly, until he either has achieved his objectives or he's made to stop, he will continue. And we can put whatever, deals on the table. He has all the aces. He doesn't have to sign up to any of this stuff. And I think that's the worry at the moment, is that we're putting the cart before the horse in a way. Everybody gets all, wound up about, well, Putin may force Zelensky to go up territory. My take is that it will be very difficult for Ukraine to gather back the territory it's got. But you can't do those negotiations in public. They've got to be done in private. And the overall, if, like, the Winter War, if Ukraine can somehow emerge from this chapter of its history with 80% of its territory, but guarantees of security, you may have the foundations of a prosperous future and a nation that's fiercely proud of the sacrifices that were made in order to guarantee its security and prosperity into the future. But how do you get there?
Well, and that's almost a Finland Second World War type solution.
The Winter War,
but you say that Putin's got all the aces. If we look at the impact that Zelensky and the Ukrainians are starting to have with their longer-range drone attacks into Russia, especially against the oil infrastructure, and the development of the Flamingo, very crude cruise missile capability that they've got, but with a massive range and a massive warhead on it. A couple of things out of this. Do you think that if this goes on and continues as a war of attrition, which it is on the front lines, that actually this operational level of conflict, attacking into Russia's ability to continue to fund and prosecute and support frontline activities will have a greater impact? And do you think what we're seeing now with the failure in what everyone assumed was a fantastic integrated air defense system that Russia was supposed to have over the whole of Russia, or certainly around its cities and strategic targets, which seems to have failed completely, and the use of relatively crude cruise-type missiles means that the sophisticated bombers that we rely on are something that we have to recognise may not necessarily be the be-all and end-all, and we can invest an awful lot more in cheaper capabilities that will have a similar or better effect as the Ukrainians seem to be having.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, isn't there? So initially, yes, is Ukraine... I mean, this is a David versus Goliath battle, isn't it? So what David can't afford to do is get locked into a war of attrition on the battlefield, because the bigger side will win. What Zelensky and Ukraine have very effectively done is try to play an asymmetric game. And I think drones have enabled them to attack oil infrastructure, which all hurts. Is it a death knell for Putin, or is it like wasps at a picnic in summer? It's just a bit irritating, because the real war is happening on the front line. that's where territory is still being gained. I think the interesting bit is that if you and I had a chat in March, we thought this was going to be an incredibly difficult year for Ukraine. It has been, but if you look at where the lines on the map have drawn, they're incredibly slow.
Oh, yes.
And if you now extrapolate to how do we get the whole of Luhansk and Donetsk, people are talking about several years more.
Yeah, UK Defence Intelligence, 4 years, another 1.9 million casualties. That's the Russian side alone to do it, and at rates of advancement of today.
So is that sustainable? I'm not so sure.
It's not.
I think the tariffs and the energy infrastructure, I mean, all credit. I mean, the Flamingo missile, you know, it was only because it was, in fact, the early missiles were pink, weren't they? So they called it a Flamingo.
Yes, I think it was pink by accident. Is the story. Whether it's a true story or not, it doesn't matter.
But if you look at those, so returning to your later point, I think, they are delivering, well, Zelensky wants to deliver 1 million drones a year out of his defence infrastructure. We're sending a lot of parts over there. That Flamingo missile is huge. It doesn't look that gainly. It doesn't look that stealthy.
It's not, I don't think.
No, but all credit, you know, it's done quickly. They don't have to do any safety checks or anything like that. They just fly it out. I do think the future for Ukraine, though, whilst it is able to fight back like that, it isn't actually. The core of the war is on the front line. Bluntly, Ukraine is running out of people. And that's something that, you know, Russia are all too aware of. A number of people have fled Ukraine. They've tried not to dip too deeply into the youngsters, because who's going to rebuild the country? Yep. Who's going to generate the new families? But I do think it's been amazing that Ukraine has lasted this well. Amazing they've held back Russia. But let's not kid ourselves. Russia is inexorably moving forward.
Well, Sean, on that depressing point, I think this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today on Times Radio Frontline.
It's great fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.